everybody. Thank you so much for being here. A big welcome to those of you who are here with us in the beautiful Pepke Auditorium on the Aspen Meadows campus, and also hello to those of you who are watching us via online stream for wherever you are in the world. So, you know, over the course, for those of you who have been here for a few days or maybe watching online, we've been talking a lot about the war in Ukraine, as we should. So we had a conversation about cybersecurity issues yesterday, and actually there's a breaking news update that maybe you can mention in a minute, Chris. We heard yesterday in the music tent from journalists who are covering the war on the ground, and of course my incredible Aspen colleague Yuliya talked about her own experiences now as a displaced person with her young children, having to leave Ukraine, leaving behind her husband who is on the front lines fighting for his country. So we've covered this from many angles. Today we're going to talk about, frankly, one of the most insidious and effective weapons of war, and that is propaganda. Propaganda is not new. It goes by many names. It's been around for thousands of years. But new technologies have made information operations both more effective but also more vulnerable. So we're going to talk about both those elements, and we've got an incredible panel here. Immediately to my left, your right, is Christo Grozev. He is the CEO and lead investigator of Bellingcat, which is a collective of researchers and citizen journalists pursuing open source and social media investigations. They use digital forensics to debunk falsehoods and also unearth clandestine information. Bellingcat actually, I think, Christo and your team, some of the recent investigations include identifying the poisoners of Alexei Navalny in 2022, the 2018 Novichok poisonings in the UK, and just this morning, they released the names and photos of the individuals who quite literally pushed the button to set off the missiles that killed scores of Ukrainians in the shopping mall in Kremenchuk just earlier this week. So we'll hear more about that. Next is Yuliya Tychkivska. Almost nailed it. She is the executive director of Aspen Kyiv. She is a longtime civic activist in Ukraine, previously a vice president of the Kyiv School of Economics and the head of the advisory group for the Ukrainian Minister of Economic Development and Trade. She was named to Forbes 30 under 30. She's now only barely over 30. Kyiv Post's top 30 under 30 and Novaya Vremya magazine's 100 most successful women in Ukraine. I hope some of you had a chance to listen to her session a couple of days ago about not only her incredible experiences throughout her not very long life, but particularly what she has experienced with her family and what she has observed in the last 4 months. And then finally, Chris Krebs. He is the founding partner of the Krebs Stamos group and the senior, I'm proud to say, the senior Newmark Fellow in Cybersecurity at the Aspen Institute, particularly at Aspen Digital, which is the program that I run. He co-chairs the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, previously co-chaired the Commission on Information Disorder. During the Trump administration, Chris was appointed the first director of CISA, which is the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where he led the national effort to defend businesses and government agencies against cyber threats, including the elections, which is what led to the president who appointed him to then fire him by tweet because he had the audacity to say that this was the most secure elections in U.S. history. We're talking about in 2020. Okay, so let's get started. Chris, I'm going to start with you. So I want to just start with a little bit of context. Talk to us about what is known in the security industry as Psyops in war. How is propaganda deployed as a weapon of war and why?
So the joke I've made in the past is effectively propaganda, disinformation, shaping the thoughts of leadership and the people is one of the oldest professions in the world. It's the third oldest profession as I see it, the second being intelligence. And really all a propaganda effort is an extension of an intelligence operation. And we talked, well, we all know what the first oldest profession is. But and honestly, they're probably all related. They could be sequentially related. But nonetheless, So we talked yesterday about how cyber is again, simply just an extension of an intelligence operation. The way that the Russian military, particularly the GRU, but also some of their other intelligence or security services, think about technology and they think about information, they don't stovepipe it like we do here. We talk about cyber, cyber, cyber. The Russians, the word cybersecurity does not exist effectively in the security parlance of the Russians. They view it as information technical and information psychological. It's all an integrated operation that aligns up underneath a combined arms approach. And so while we, chase rabbit holes around attacks on critical infrastructure, you should be looking at a cyber attack not necessarily just, for instance, as the physical effect or the outcome of that attack, but what's the psychological impact of a cyber attack. And that's where we were looking, particularly for 2020, as we got closer to the end of the election, or the run-up to the election. I wasn't as concerned, frankly, about an actual Russian operation that was able to reach in and touch an election system, because the defenses that were layered around it. What I was more worried about, frankly, was someone coming in and claiming they had done something, or they had attributed some sort of technical disruption to an effective operation that would then undermine the confidence in the process. We're seeing similar sorts of activities right now, in fact, has been running for months and months and months in Ukraine, where the Russians are attempting to seed doubt. They're trying to undermine confidence. They're trying to undermine the legitimacy of Zelensky and the Ukrainian, frankly, as even a country, the legitimacy of Ukraine. They're trying to undermine the legitimacy of the United States in supporting Ukraine. So what they're looking to do, again, is to distract, to confuse. The intent is never to actually establish a single proof point. It's just to continue to raise doubts, raise questions in the minds of the observers and those that ultimately support whatever the national effort is.
Raising that, right, doubt and trust are incredibly effective weapons, and the Russians are very good at deploying propaganda, but not always. So, Christo, I want you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing today in terms of the kind of mis and disinformation that Russia is deploying about Ukraine, and also some of the incredible work that you've done being able to debunk some of their claims.
First, I would jump off of what Chris said, that Russia sees disinformation essentially as a psychological game, a psychological warfare. Every single entity in Russia, every single intelligence agency, security agency, have their own department producing fake information during peacetime. Now, during wartime, this is the prerogative of the GRU. So GRU, the military intelligence, they have the final say over what kind of false narratives are being fed out there. There's a whole faculty at the military academies throughout Russia that is called Department for Special Propaganda, Special Information Propaganda, which is essentially psychological operations. And all of these people are currently engaged with setting up the narratives that are being spread out. Now, and what the narratives have changed as a strategy over the years, because in the past, they were very good at creating one alternative explanation for everything, one fake alternative narrative. What has happened over the last 6 to 7 years, which is partially a product of many debunking organizations appearing like Bellingcat, but also the technology changing completely and allowing people direct access to the raw material and being able to see for themselves. That whole approach has changed into what many scientists call the fire hose of disinformation, which means a number of different alternative theories and narratives are going out. We call it sort of the disinformation multiverse. It's essentially a whack-a-mole game that they create. They produce 7, 10, 12, 20 different narratives regarding the same event, and it makes it very difficult to debunk it, because the moment you debunk one version of the events, then here goes another version of the events. Let's take what happened. We'll take 2 examples. One is what happened with the downing of Malaysian airliner MH17 in 2014. That's when the Russian military intelligence perfected this fire hose technology of disinformation. Instead of producing one, for those of you who don't remember or don't know it, it was an airline with 298 passengers that was shot down over eastern Ukraine by, as we proved, and the court or the prosecution in the Netherlands has proven, by a Russian missile. Instead of Russia at that point coming up with one alternative narrative saying it wasn't a Russian missile, it was a Ukrainian missile, they came up with a total of, we counted up to the time that it became 19 alternative narratives. That included, it was a Russian, it was a Ukrainian missile, it was a Mossad operation, it was a Ukrainian plane, a Ukrainian fighter plane, it was a Ukrainian missile that tried to shoot down President Putin's plane which was flying about 1,000 miles away. And then there was an alternative theory that the plane was actually pre-filled with dead bodies and it was just a setup, a false flag operation, and so on and so forth, up to the final version that they came up with in one source, which was, yes, we did shoot it down, but it was a provocatia. It was a Ukrainian setup so that we would shoot at the wrong plane. So when they come up with 19 narratives, you, as a media organization, as a debunker, as a consumer of news, you just don't know how to process that. And that's a very, very smart strategy. Let's jump to what happened yesterday, or the last couple of days, the Kremenchuk bombing or shelling by a Russian missile. Russia came up with 6 alternative, mutually exclusive and incompatible narratives. First they said, Lavrov came up and said that we didn't shoot at that location at all. Then another government official came up and said, we shot at that location, but we shot at a arms depot that was provided by the Americans. And a third alternative version was that, yes, we hit the commercial center, the shopping mall, but it was a shopping mall converted into a depot, and so on and so forth and so forth. So we had to come up with a very, very long piece yesterday that we just published, where we debunk each of these alternative claims, but it takes time, it takes effort, it's a whack-a-mole, and that's why that strategy actually works for them.
So trust, doubt, and sowing mistrust. Yuliya, you, of course, live in Kyiv. You experienced everything that was happening leading up to the war, fled Ukraine, but are still, your husband is there, you're very tied to it. Talk about how this affects you, how this kind of fog of, nonsense, honestly, coming out of Russia affects Ukrainians.
Thank you. So just to conclude and maybe jump up what just gentlemen mentioned. So how this propaganda is working. So truth is irrelevant. So they're using truthful information, a lot of fake, and blend it into the story which influence emotions of people. So then, people who are a target of this propaganda, they start to be emotional about it. It could be hate, it could be anger, it could be adoration. So what really matters is a narrative. And this narrative, or dozens of narratives, are repeating all the time. So the audience feel like in a warm bath, feeling the same story. And talking about Ukraine, my colleagues already mentioned this, narratives which are sometimes surreal for us, but they're quite well perceived and supported in Russia. And 2 points I want to make here. It's very dangerous for us, I'm talking civilized democracies, to be maybe not too conscious about this propaganda, because we see, for instance, the Kyiv narrative, most striking is that Ukraine shouldn't exist. It's not existed. It was artificially created by Lenin. Imagine you wake up in the morning and somebody said, United States doesn't exist. It's not a country. Hitler or whatever Stalin founded it. It's a mistake. Come on, how could it happen? So it's such an absurd that we think, okay, it's propaganda. But then they are really working smart. So they are combining this truthful information, this fake information, creating new and new narratives, and we need to be very conscious, very ready to fight each moment. So talking about Ukrainian narrative, so this one is the most striking. I am exist, my family exists, my relatives exist for many, many times. And it's interesting how it's like changing all the time. They have this key narrative we see, like before 2014 and before this Crimea invasion, and it was like Ukraine as a failed state, it shouldn't exist, like we should like go and like help them, we need to learn them how to live. Then it switched to this neo-Nazi. And what is interesting thing, and I have a quote here, I found, which I think it's really very relevant. You remember Orwell's "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." And I think it's so important to recognize that big part of propaganda is replacing of meanings of like already well-known like things. So we are not talking about war. They are not talking about war. They're talking about conflict. They're not talking about killing Ukrainians. They're talking about like liberation and like Nazi liberation. And there are a lot of things like that. They call Nazi a person, and it's like in their like ideological documents cited, a person who don't want to transfer the sovereignty of her own country to Russia. So it means neo-Nazi today. So, and that's a very like, you know, it's a very dangerous, it's a very important topic to talk to today. So I do believe that propaganda is definitely like key weapon which Russia use. And like being here for a few days, like and talking to different people, like who are open-minded. But sometimes I receive the questions which are just like pain me, because it's like exactly like propaganda which is going on here. And we need to be very certain, and we have a hero here who's doing like a lot of like real like on the ground work, but we need to mention the budgets which are investing, like which were invested for propaganda last like 20 years. Yeah. And we need to count people who work for Russia Today channels in Berlin, here, in Latin America. It's huge.
I want to talk about, actually, the propaganda from, that affects the Russian people, also some propaganda coming out of the, I'm using the term propaganda, which generally is derisive, but some information that came actually from the White House in the lead up to the war, which was part of sort of the influence operations. But first, I want to just stick with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine for a second and ask you a follow-up question, Yuliya. It seems to us from where we're sitting that for the Russians to say you don't exist as a country, that your president is a Nazi, who ironically a Jew, the country is full of Nazis, that has had the effect of sort of almost hardening the spines, not that they needed to, of Ukrainians against Russia. And what we've been interesting, I want you to talk a little bit about is some of the I almost want to call them memes that have come out of Ukraine that are also sort of counter-influence operations. I'm talking specifically about the downing of the Russian ship, and also, whether it's true or not, it may be apocryphal, of the Ukrainian grandmother who gave the sunflower seeds to the Russian soldier and said, "Put these in your pocket, so when you are killed, the sunflowers will grow out of the ground."
The babushka de la muerta.
Yeah. So talk about a little bit about that for a minute, and then I want to come to.
Thank you for this question. Indeed, like a sense of humor is our big strength. A number of memes we like produced during this 4 very difficult months of this cruel war is enormous, a lot of them. And that was give us like, it's help us to be resilient. And you're absolutely sure. This propaganda launched by Putin and like Russia and Russians, it helped us to mobilize. So like what we saw, like all this, like, I would not say like, I would say it's like informational campaign, or I would say it like creative stories and myths which were born during the war. It's all grassroots initiatives. So it's not somebody in the cabinet who was thinking, oh, which message we should like put into like into society so they like feel like whatever. No, it's people like who are fighting. Each of us stood up, like, and our like idea is to like do something. You just need to do every day, do something to win the war, like sooner than later, and like and rebuild Ukraine, which we would like to see. So I think the key idea is that it's grassroots. It's full of creativity. It's full of humor. It's an attitude which gives us resilience. But like from some points, we also saw like some narratives and kind of maybe propaganda from the government, but it was like absolutely understandable. For instance, like when they were not telling us the real numbers of how many Ukrainian soldiers were killed, just to keep people like fight, keep like society like mood to be like to feel that we are fighting back, and like that was like that's absolutely understandable for me. Like like other example could be, I even don't know. Maybe
Kyiv.
this, like, maybe like it was also made up from people, but like key propaganda message might be like, we believe in armed forces of Ukraine. So it's like, it's not like proactive, it's not against somebody, it's just ideas to mobilize people even more, let them feel this resilience, feel that we are fighting for our values, and it's like, and we will win, because good will prevail. So I think this, like, from this perspective.
If I could just jump in, because you've missed a very important meme. I think the most important meme of this war has been the Ukrainian tractor dragging Russian tanks.
Yes.
You should see this, look.
Yes, exactly.
I got it here.
This meme, as proven, is very influential, but it actually impacted political decisions. It created the impression that the Russian army is extremely incompetent and that the Ukrainian society is fully mobilized, and Ukraine is winning. At least for the beginning, for the first couple of months, that was a very strong impression created by such memes. And in fact, I know for a fact that several political leaders in Europe were influenced in continuing or starting to provide weapons to Ukraine because it realized that Ukraine has a chance to win. If that perception that Ukraine can win had not been created, also through memes like the tractor, then many governments would not have given weapons. So it has real-life consequences.
Absolutely.
And so what we're really seeing here take place is the intersection of power, influence, and technology. And the pervasiveness of the internet and of information availability across social media platforms, you name them, nations are figuring out, and security services are figuring out, as they have for the last several years, on how to harness them to achieve their strategic objectives. And the Russians, again, in 2016, trying to interfere with the US election, they caught us by surprise. We didn't necessarily, in the intelligence community, anticipate their abuse of social media. It's all flipped around, though. And I was personally astonished that the Russians did not take out telecommunications and internet service in Ukraine at the early stages of the war. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I don't know why. We'll see. Maybe it was because they thought they were going to be able to take over Kyiv in 2 days, and why tear something down only to have to rebuild it? Plus, maybe they were using it anyway for their own communications. But the point is, they gave up an advantage. The Russians gave up an advantage they have, and the Ukrainians immediately took the initiative and established the narratives using, whether we want to call it propaganda or whatever. So when you talk about the Snake Island issue, you talk about the ghost of Kyiv, the Babushka de la Muerta, you talk about the airport that was taken back 5 different times from the Spetsnaz that were coming in. It allowed Ukraine to establish their dominance of the information ecosystem and immediately put Russia on the defensive, which then required Russia to respond. And I think we'll probably talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
One thing, just one last thing on the technology intersection with content. I think what has happened is a complete equalization of the technical capability of the citizen versus the capability of the state in terms of quality of a video. And this paired with the virality of the TikTok environment or the YouTube environment, where something can get very quick virality, despite the fact that previously it had no following, just depending on how viral that particular content is. It just means that when you have 100,000 Ukrainians producing quality content because they can from their phone, and you have literally 50 Russian officers creating their own memes, it's a losing battle for the Russians because you get so much more viral content from.
In the quality, to your point, the quality of the content, but it's the broad availability of it. I mean, I could watch Ukrainian drones blowing the tops off Russian tanks all day long. All day long. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah, and just to add here, so like my friend just posted a post on Facebook how she ordered 3 Starlinks. So that's how it's happening.
Yeah.
So everyone like just contribute to the resilience of this telecommunication like industry as well. So I think that this like united action was a big important point. Same time, like a lot of people were preparing, maybe not enough, but for instance, I bought a radio which works without like electricity, like and yeah, just so.
I want to talk a little bit about Russia. You know, Chris, you mentioned the ubiquity of information, but of course, what Russia has been trying to do is shut off all access to information other than state propaganda. And arguably...
Inside Russia.
Inside Russia inside Russia is what I'm talking about. And, you know, arguably, the lion's share of Putin's propaganda efforts are directed at his own people to maintain support. So what are you, Christo, talk a little bit about what you're seeing about propaganda targeted at the Russian people. How effective is that?
It is very effective. Russia is essentially a divided society more than ever before. It has a small minority of well-informed people who are not lazy to look out for information despite the time and effort it takes to get a VPN, to make sure that you're not caught using a VPN to access illegal information, to make sure you don't share with your neighbors or colleagues even what you found out. All of these are a counter motivating society to find the truth, but you still have about 20% of society that does that. Then you have 80% of society that are generally lazy, and that's the case in every other society as well. They are deprived of even accidental access to such information, which before they would have gotten through on the way to work by listening to somebody listening to a Radio Echo of Moscow, or watching TV Rain, or ending up on the Insider. All of these are blocked and inaccessible. Twitter is inaccessible. Facebook is inaccessible in Russia. So what you have now is 80% of society is getting their news from state channels. And state channels, what is interesting here is you can create a complete fake reality using real facts. Because during a time of war, you have almost 10,000 times more newsworthy events per day. And if you pick the right ones, you can create a completely false view on what's happening in the war, and you don't have to even forge facts. You don't have to invent facts. You just have to selectively select them. This is what state media is doing, and creating a very emotional picture of hatred to the neo-Nazis, and that is a complete term deprived of any meaning. Neo-Nazi, as you said, is anybody who doesn't want Russia to win, is a neo-Nazi. That's the concept, right? So unfortunately, you have a very emotionally invested 80% of the population that are not open to even finding what the truth is. That doesn't mean that that is not going to change, because despite the fact that these 80% are not going to suddenly start liking Ukraine or start thinking about the monstrosity of the war and the human rights violations, they are susceptible to seeing failures to succeed in the war as a sign of weakness of Putin. And that is very dangerous for Putin.
And if I may add here, just so what we were doing, like with France and some other Aspen fellows during first 2 weeks of war, so we were organizing media campaigns, engaging celebrities, top bloggers, you know, Instagram bloggers, TikTokers, and trying to reach out to regular Russians just to let them know what's going on, and like ask them and motivate them to stood up and like go in against the war. And if you have like millions of them protesting, not all of them will be arrested. So it's a different, you know, combination, like understanding all threats. But after 2 weeks of like attempts, like it led to nothing at all. And we used like a people, like a celebrities who were very like supported before the war. So, and for us, it was really frustrating experience. It's exactly what was just mentioned, that like they do live in this propaganda. They are not capable to hear another story. So just we gave up, of course. And I think that's very important practical example, like how it works and why it's like trying to reach out to them now, it's not working.
It's worth just mentioning that what is happening, the complete lockdown of independent journalism in Moscow, in Russia, that has happened in the last few months is unprecedented. Prior to the war, there were, you know, there were independent news organizations that were doing, I mean, they were always under threat, but they were operating. And even in the I lived in Moscow in the 80s, at the height of the Soviet Union. Western journalists were operating pretty freely there and reporting what was going on. Not so today. It is unprecedented. I want to talk a little bit, Chris, I want to just talk about what we're seeing, what the United States' role is, particularly in the lead up to war and how effective that is. And then what we're seeing, I want you to talk a little bit about China and how that's spreading to other parts of the world.
So some of the key differences that I noticed from the U.S. government involvement of the further invasion of Ukraine, and I compare it to 2016 and even the 2020 election, is that it used to take months and months, if not a year, for the intelligence community to say, look, this is what we're seeing out there, and it's attributed to the Kremlin or whatever. And then you roll up through 2020, and we got better. There was one individual incident with the Iranians where I think we were able to get some intelligence out on the order of 27 hours, which is just like lightning speed. It was lightning speed at the time. What we saw happen this go-around was the intelligence community getting intelligence on what Russian decision-making was on the invasion of Ukraine and start releasing it to the public as early, frankly, as November of 2021. It wasn't just a January thing. It was November, maybe even a little bit earlier. And in some cases, as I understand it, the declassification came within hours, if not an hour or less. So what we've seen is a shift in strategy, at least for this case, of the U.S. leadership that sees sunlight as, Oliver Wendell Holmes, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that is going to be a future tool in the toolkit to counter these asymmetric threats of disinformation, of propaganda, and we will continue to see, because it is a move-counter-move situation. The Russians have changed their tactics, they've developed. Here's the problem, though. Everyone else in the world is watching. Everyone in the world is watching. China has changed their tactics on disinformation and propaganda. They used to be a very low-key, very low-level sort of operator, but there was a great report released by a French think tank last fall that talked about the Russification of Chinese information operations. And you're seeing them become much more aggressive, go after people, go after companies. In fact, it was yesterday or maybe Tuesday or Monday, where the U.S. government and a cyber threat intelligence company, Mandiant, released a report on Chinese information operators going after Australian and U.S. mining and rare earth companies and besmirching them, reputational harm, saying that they're creating environmental harm and things like that. Why? It's because they're in the same global market and competing in the rare earth space. So they're trying to tear down their opponents and find a market advantage. It's a much more aggressive technique. It's much broader than they used to be in terms of more focused approach. So I suspect that we will see many more countries out there develop these capabilities. Look at how the Russians have done it. Look at how the Chinese done it. There is a bright spot, though. Like I said, we are changing our tactics and how we're uncovering and disclosing them. But every time you use one of these platforms, social media platforms, or otherwise use the information ecosystem, you have digital exhaust. You leave a trail of bits. And that allows people like Christo to come in and have the exposure operations and call these people out. So it's not hopeless. It is certainly quite a mountain or a hill to climb. But we're getting better at understanding, and we're getting better also as a people of inoculating ourselves against some of these activities.
We're about to take your questions. We are quickly running out of time, which is frustrating. But I have one other question I want to direct to the two of you, if I could just ask you to answer briefly, which is a brief look forward. We know that Russia there's been a lot of Russian casualties in the war. Those body bags are going to start to come home, or if not come home, the people, the lack of body bags, the lack of individuals coming home. Russia is not necessarily sharing that information with the families of the dead. Ukrainians are. How is this going to begin to, how is that going to begin to impact attitudes in Russia, and how can propaganda or information help that?
Well, this is the only type of information that can change potentially the attitude of Russians to the war. It's not about the lack of humanity, it's not about the cruelties performed, because Russians avoid, like many other nations, they're very adverse to cognitive dissonance, so they don't want to even read information that would present their soldiers in a negative light. However, they are worrying, they're beginning to worry that they may not be winning the war, that the victory is coming at a cost, whatever the victory is going to be defined of, is coming at a cost that was different than the one promised to them, which means many, many more tens of thousands of dead soldiers than they anticipated by Putin calling this a non-war, but a special operation that goes hand in hand with the assumption that it will be about 1,000 people at most. But then there's also the other side effects of perception of a negative outcome, which is the economic situation, the loss of quality of life, and so on and so forth. We're watching the most frequently asked questions on Russian search engines on a daily basis. And what we found is that the beginning of the war, the questions were very gung-ho, such as when are we going to be in Kyiv, and what can we take over, what is the industry of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So they were thinking about essentially stealing a country. Now these same people are asking questions such as, the top 10 questions today are, when is Ukraine going to invade Russia? So they're actually worrying about that. How many are the real casualties? What really happened to the cruiser Moscow? What really, where can I buy dollars? What country still gives Russia's visas to Russians? And the most important question, when are we going to get IKEA back? So, so this is what's going to change, yes, actually, the attitude to the war.
Yeah, it hits home.
Just very, there is nothing, nothing to add. It's absolutely true. And just to maybe comment on that, it's like actions, our actions, which matters. So only by experiencing something, I believe this propaganda will a bit fall down. So that's why we need to win. We need to win soon. We need to rebuild much better, more transparent, more democratic Ukraine. And that would be an example, and that would be a very effective tool to let them understand what's going on really in this world.
Amen. Absolutely. Okay, let's take your questions. We have a few minutes left. I don't know who's got the mics, but there's this gentleman right here. If you can just, well, hold on, wait for the mic, because we've got a virtual audience. They won't be able to hear you. Thank you.
So you talked about it yesterday and again today, the speed of the declassification and dissemination of intelligence information. Did that play a major role in the world's response and reaction this time around in Ukraine versus Crimea?
I think it had a couple effects. One is that I think it had a real-time effect on Russia and their invasion. I think it delayed the invasion by a week or more, which kept Russian troops in Russian territory, drinking, selling gasoline, depleting food stocks, and not getting. So that actually affected the ability to roll into Ukraine in their reach, because the Russians have actually not done a very good job on supply lines and restocking. I think depending on which country you're talking about, yes, it helped, I think, with the UK, for instance, in any of the other Five Eyes or the intelligence sharing countries, there was a fairly uniform understanding and probably information intelligence sharing. There were others, though, I think, of particularly European countries, and then almost like the entire global South was very skeptical. And I'll leave aside Zelensky for the moment, but there was a lot of doubt that this was going to happen, because it's like Russian troops in Europe, that's crazy. That's not going to happen. But it did happen, and you've seen there have been some effects in the intelligence services of certain countries in Europe where heads of intelligence agencies were sacked because they got it so wrong.
France.
How is that different than what happened with Crimea, if you look at the world's reaction?
The question was, how is this different than the world's reaction to when Russian invasion of Crimea, which of course was pretty much a non-response. Christo, go ahead.
I think that's exactly where the difference is. In this particular case, Russia had prepared a sophisticated casus belli in both cases. In Crimea, the so-called oppression of the locals and the sort of people being killed for speaking Russian, and so on and so forth. In this particular case, in the current war, they had prepared a very sophisticated plan of creating false flag operations, including discovering mass graves with hundreds of innocent children being buried there by Ukrainian Nazis and so on and so forth. But by pre-announcing the war, months in advance, they were deprived of this capability to actually, they still tried, but it didn't fly because nobody trusted anymore. So that leaking of the information delegitimized the war for much of the world population. That's where it came, not so much for intelligence agencies, but for the population.
I think the intel piece is a little bit separate, but what I found so striking about this event was the unified Western response to Russia. There are geopolitical flashpoints every decade going back to the 40s. I mean, when you talk about, like, in the 70s, 80s, the dirty war in Chile, you talk about the collapse of Yugoslavia, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Things happen every decade. The question is, how does the rest of the world respond? And it's been such a remarkable shift and unified response that I think, in fact, it's changed, and it's changed the view of the West in the terms of, at least in the perspective of Beijing and their designs for Taiwan.
Let's take another question. I see, let's go ahead, come right down here, please. Thank you.
Hi. So you talked about the power of propaganda to cultivate and fuel negative emotions like fear and confusion and hate. I'm wondering, what are the ethics, and is it possible for us to consider weaponizing positive propaganda, and how would we navigate the ethics of an investment, of a deeper investment in propaganda, if it's about information and not necessarily just about cybersecurity, where the way that Russia's viewing it? What are the ethics behind that?
I mean, this is the question. So in the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder, we looked at what are some of the kind of systemic and structural issues underpinning the information ecosystem and that's leading to this information pollution we have. And you even saw it with the Facebook leaks and Francis Hagen, that some of the optimization of engagement is rage clicking and, you know, the alligator brain effectively, like keep going, keep going. So I think what, you know, the first step we have to do from a regulatory perspective is introduce some mechanisms that at least have standard transparency from social media platforms of what, it's not about content moderation, but it's what are their policies. Everyone just needs to kind of show what their policies are, show what their moderation performance and metrics are. What are they optimizing their algorithms for? How do we do? Until we really understand how the programs are designed, I don't think we can get to a point where we decide what the true outcomes are going to be. And then that also keeps it in a safe First Amendment and civil rights and civil liberties perspective, which has to be the beginning of your values-based approach.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, unfortunately. This gentleman over here in the blue shirt. Sorry, I can't see very well, so if you're somebody I know, I apologize. I can't really see.
So building off what you just said and the reaction to the so-called Ministry of Truth and the effort to respond to disinformation, sorry, from the perspective of democracies, how do we think about what we look to our governments for versus what do we look to NGOs to take the lead on combating disinformation?
Maybe very briefly, I'll start. Like, we in Ukraine feel like you could be very brave, you could be very courageous, but without real weapon, you cannot win the war. And same here. I think important understanding is that we need to develop a weapon, we need to build institutions, we need to build education, we need to develop critical thinking to prevent propaganda from any part of the world influence the truth and the life of people.
Look, I think this is really, really complicated because I, for one, do not think government should be in the role of the arbiter of information, the Ministry of Truth piece that just came up with the DHS Disinformation Board. But it's a whole of society response, which is the really cheesy kind of cliche way to put it. But if you look at Edelman research, has said the most trusted public figures are business leaders. So we need more business leaders. We need more accountability across certain groups like medical licensing boards at the state level, state bars, and you actually have to hold people accountable that promote things like election lies. You have to sanction them. You have to take away their license to practice. There are mechanisms available to us, and we covered a bunch of these again in the final report. But there is no single bullet. There is no single solution, certainly not one that's coming from government that's going to fix this.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I just want to make one last comment, which is I think what we're seeing in Ukraine, which is the information is shared. It is grassroots. It's coming from the government, but it's also coming from individuals, from organizations. It is the exemplar of sort of a whole of society response in many ways. I want to thank this panel so much. Yes, thank you. I just want to say, I wish you had more time to hear about the extraordinary work of Bellingcat. Please follow them. It's amazing. A special thank you to Yuliya and everything that she has experienced and doing and the resilience of her and her family and the Ukrainian people. And thank you so much, Chris, for your wisdom and context. Thank you all.
Thank you.